Some years ago, I started asking every sex educator I met the same question. If you had a room full of clergy, what would you tell us to make us better ministers? Now, I asked this question of every big-shot sexuality educator I encountered, and I sought them out. I asked Carol Queen of the Center for Sex and Culture in San Francisco, America's first person to get a PhD in sexology. I asked Megan Andeyu at the Center for Sexual Pleasure and Health in Rhode Island, and Charlie Glickman, and Reed Mihelko, and David J., Q-Tip Wilson, Joni Blank, Unitarian Universalist, Alex Morgan, and Monique Darling, all from the Bay Area. I asked Laura Antonou and Melina Williams from New York. I asked Annie Sprinkle, also UU, and Tristan Taormino from Los Angeles. I talked to academics and activists, sexologists and sex workers, porn stars and bloggers. I talked to people in all kinds of places and in all sorts of venues. And a remarkable thing happened. They all had almost exactly the same response. First, wow, nobody's ever asked me that before. Thank you. And let's start with shame. Let's start with shame, they said. Let's look at the role organized religion has played in perpetuating a culture where people are disconnected from their own bodies, divorced from pleasure, embarrassed by their own arousal. Let's talk about creating healthy clergy, they said. Clergy who are comfortable in their own sexual identity and expression, who are educated and who can offer solid, fact-based advice that does not violate the values and tenets of their faith, but is practical. We cannot talk about sex, love, and relationships without addressing shame. Even in our enlightened 21st century, even in our safe and affirming Unitarian Universalist spaces, we must talk about shame when we talk about sex and sexuality. Shame is what keeps us silent. Shame is what prevents us from really communicating with our partners about what we want. Shame is fed by our fear of being judged as wrong or sick or unworthy in some way. Shame is projected anticipatory rejection. It is the voice inside that says, if you really knew me, you would not love me because I am not worthy. I am broken. Shame can keep people who love each other very much in the dark, making each guess what the other wants or likes or doesn't like. And until we can let go of shame and communicate clearly, we are stuck trying to read our partner's minds, and that is always a losing game. One night during my years at seminary, I attended a class taught by my colleague Megan Andeyu from Rhode Island. It was a short kind of Sexuality 101 class at a Boston area branch of Good Vibrations, which is a retail outlet and educational resource center originally founded in the Bay Area in 1977 by a faithful and longtime member of our UU congregation of Oakland, Joni Blank. Part of this class was being filmed by MTV and featured a young couple who wanted to learn more about sexuality to improve their marriage. Now, my friend Megan is a force of nature. She is classically beautiful. She has red hair. I think it's from a bottle. I'm not going to swear to that. That's a thing you don't, it's too impolite to ask, but it is fabulously red. She often looks like a 1940s pinup girl, just always dressed exquisitely, and she's funny and sexy and smart. And these two young people, by the end of that 1-hour class, they looked a little shell-shocked. You remember that old advertisement for the Jensen speakers, where the guy's in the chair and the tie is flapping out behind him because of the noise coming at him? That's sort of what they looked like. So when the MTV interviewer, and this is particularly delicious, he took these two 22-year-old kids and stood them up in front of a wall that had a display of things you cannot put on regular TV, and asked them what they thought. And the young woman said, I feel like I should go to church and repent for even being here. She told us about stuff I didn't know the human body could do. And I saw the staff cringe, and inside my heart broke a little bit. When the television cameras were turned off, because I did want to get a job someday as a minister, I approached the couple one at a time to check in, see how they were doing. I told them that I was both a sexuality educator and a minister. And I spoke first to the husband. I mentioned that I'd heard his wife make that remark to the interviewer, and I asked his thoughts, and I checked if he was okay. He replied that he'd always been taught that masturbation was a sin, and that they'd learned about a lot more than masturbation in that night's class. He seemed conflicted, like he thought the new information was good, but it contradicted what he'd been taught about what was right and true and moral. So I asked him if he thought God loved us. And he said yes. I asked him if he thought God gave us gifts to enjoy. And he said yes, again, but with a little hesitation. So I took a different tack, and I asked him what his favorite food was. And he looked at me a little cross-eyed, and he said, rice and beans. I said, okay. What's your favorite music? He said, jazz. What's your favorite kind of art? He liked modern art. Okay. And we talked about how our bodies are a gift from God. Now, there's no earthly scientific reason why his taste buds appreciate one thing and mine appreciate another. Those cultural variations are a gift from the divine. The taste buds are wired to the pleasure centers of our brain. That is without moral judgment. They just are. That's how things are wired. And they give us pleasure when we taste different things. The same thing is true with our auditory senses. When some people may find joy and pleasure listening to birds, others want to hear loud music, and others still want to hear silence. Sound hits the pleasure centers of our brain as well, and that pleasure is a gift from God. So we went through the same process for pleasure from all our other senses. We discussed that there was no evolutionary reason why we had different tastes, only the wonderful diversity of the human experience. So finally I told him, look, the largest organ in the human body is our skin. It is wired for pleasure in 1,000 ways, just like our mouths and our ears and our eyes and our noses. I cannot believe in a God who loves us, who would wire us for pleasure in all these other ways, then give us this magnificent thing with our skin and say, no, that's not for you to enjoy. I just can't believe that. And he said, but the Bible says it's all a sin. And so we talked about how ancient laws were created, largely to control and manage people and resources. In the ancient texts of the Hebrew Scriptures, they were written for a people who were exiled and in danger of cultural extinction. And laws were made with the goal of making sure for the survival of the culture. Anything that did not lead directly to more healthy children being born was outlawed. And whether that was a lack of understanding about germs and food preparation that came with kosher rules for when all of your plates and things are made of wood. You can't serve meat and milk in the same one because wood absorbs and things go bad and people get sick and die. And so they may not have understood why that stuff was happening, but they knew it happened and they knew it hurt people and they knew it had to be outlawed so that they would survive. And they didn't quite understand human reproduction, but they had some general ideas, and so anything that seemed to jeopardize the perpetuation of the Hebrew people was outlawed. And then we talked about sin, and how sin is the stuff that separates us from God. And I offered that I could not think of a more holy thing in this world than to share love with another person and to bring them joy and to share pleasure with them. I cannot think of a more beautiful, holy thing to do. Sin comes into the mixture when we don't respect the other person, and when we use that person for our own ends. That's not loving and giving, and that's where it gets in the neighborhood of sin. So I left him talking with Megan and went to have a very similar conversation with his wife. We talked about her favorite food and music and art, and we talked about the church she grew up in. I grew up Catholic, she said. Me too. And her eyes opened wide. And I assured her that there are clergy who do understand what it means to hold moral values and who understand that pleasure is in itself not sinful, but a gift from God. As with any sexuality class, the primary lesson is not so much about mechanics as it is about communication. The lesson that Megan offered that night was about how to talk to each other. She encouraged the lovers to communicate, to talk about what they liked and didn't like, and to lovingly and playfully explore themselves and each other and share what they learned. And that's the largest part of what the thing we know as love is made of: communication. Certainly there's chemistry. Chemistry is real. Pheromones are real. Oxytocin is real. Endorphins, all that stuff is real. And in loving relationships, however they are structured, communication is required. And communication is undermined by shame. Shame is what makes us stammer and blush and keeps us from telling our partner what we like. Shame is what causes adult people to still use baby words like coochie or winky to refer to their genitals. In a class, I've had people in their 60s use that language because they've never had other language affirmed. Shame makes people so uncomfortable that they put off telling their doctor about their sexual dysfunction until the symptoms become unbearable, and at that point, much more difficult to treat. Joni Price, who's an educator who works specifically on issues around sexuality in the elderly, I heard her speak at a conference once, and she said something profound. She said, erectile dysfunction is not the disease, it is a symptom of something else going on. But we're so uncomfortable talking about it that we treat it as if it is the thing that needs to be treated, and we don't look at the underlying heart conditions or blood pressure or other things that are happening. It's a rare thing to find someone unaffected by shame, particularly in the area of sexuality. Maya Angelou was a celebrated poet and novelist. She was awarded a doctoral degree. She received the Nobel Prize for Literature and was poet laureate of the United States. And at one point in her life, she was a sex worker. She was a young woman and a single mother, and she worked to feed her family as a sex worker, as a prostitute. She also worked as a madam for lesbian prostitutes, and she danced on tables for money. She wrote about those years in her book, Gather Together in My Name, and spoke publicly about her experience in many interviews. And yet, when she died, many publications scrubbed those lines from her obituary. 21st century newspaper editors were more ashamed of Maya Angelou's struggle and past than she ever was. So Thursday is St. Valentine's Day. That's why we're all the red and we're talking about love. And it gives me a chance to wear red. Now, St. Valentine's Day is a curious tradition. Started by the ancient Romans, it was initially a fertility ritual in which drunken men sacrificed a goat and a dog and then whipped women with the hides of the freshly sacrificed animals. Women who were struck were believed to be blessed with ease in childbirth that year. Lucky them. There were other rituals associated with the 3-day feast of Lupercalia, including a lottery of names drawn from a jar to determine assigned sexual pairings that lasted either the length of the festival or, if the two people proved to like each other, a full year. They say anything can happen in Jersey. I'm pretty sure our lottery would not do that. Now, this party was later associated with the name Valentine after Rome executed two different men named Valentine, several years apart, but in the general vicinity of February 14th, around the same time as Lupercalia. In the 5th century, Pope Gelasius I co-opted the pagan revelry with a celebration of the two martyred Christians and made it a more polite, clothed, and distinctly less drunken holiday. The part we understand now about romantic love was inserted centuries later by Shakespeare and Chaucer. And then when Hallmark printed its first line of Valentine's cards in 1913, that pretty much sealed it. A once sacred drunken revelry of lust and fertility had been twisted into a saccharin-coated commercial event celebrating heteronormative patriarchal monogamy and chocolate in heart-shaped boxes. Now, I can't say for sure, obviously, but I'd bet that neither of the Valentines in question would be much impressed with the secular American holiday that bears their name. Far too often, religious leaders have a way of mucking up things that are holy. Sexual shame has been normalized and institutionalized by thousands of years of church teachings, which not coincidentally served to shore up the power structure of the patriarchal church hierarchy. Perhaps the most significant influence into the West's culture of sexual shame was Augustine of Hippo. Who here knows of Augustine? Yeah, some Catholics and some ex-Catholics. Augustine, and I need to mention this because in all of the classic artistic portrayals of Augustine, he's a white guy with a beard. Augustine was born in what is now Algeria. He was an African man. Let us remember that. Too often history gets whitewashed. So Augustine was a 4th century scholar of philosophy and religion. He was born in what is now Algeria on the northern coast of Africa, across the Mediterranean from Italy. After his abusive father died, his mother focused on managing and raising her son as her life's purpose. Eager to get out from under his mother's smothering attention, Augustine saved up his money and took a boat in the middle of the night across the Mediterranean to Carthage, where he sought to study rhetoric or philosophy. He did not let his mother know where he was bound, or even that he was leaving, which had a devastating effect on her psyche and a liberating effect on his. As a young man in Carthage, Augustine is said to have indulged in all the pleasures that a cosmopolitan city had to offer a young man alone and away from home. And it is during those years that he is said to have penned perhaps my most favorite prayer: Lord, grant me chastity and temperance, but not yet. While there, he joined a series of sects and organizations that held rigid and extreme ideas about theology and morality, but never connected deeply with them, really, and existed at the edges, filling low-level positions. Augustine met and took up housekeeping with a woman, had a child with her, and by all accounts, settled into a happy life in Milan. It wasn't glorious or flashy, but it was a happy life. They had a son. And then Augustine's mother arrived. Remember her? She was outraged by his situation, living unmarried with a woman who was really no better than himself, and apparently her son lacked any ambition to improve his situation. In short order, she arranged a more suitable marriage to a woman of significant wealth and reputation. She told her son to rid himself of his partner and their son, so that he could marry this other woman. And he did. He sent them away and was alone for 2 years. This makes my teeth itch. Until the girl his mother had chosen for him came of age and could be married. And all of that broke this man. He married the woman his mother had chosen, moved back to Africa, and then after his mother died, he sold all his belongings and withdrew to a life of asceticism and study. He left his wife and new son, and entered a monastery, and later founded his own religious order, known today still as the Augustinians. He studied voraciously and wrote prodigiously. It is said that he kept 2 scribes employed full-time, writing down everything that came out of his mouth, on subjects ranging from his personal spiritual journey to theology, sin, morality, redemption, and salvation. His conversion to Christianity and subsequent embrace of asceticism was a complete reversal of the indulgences of his younger years. It is as though he woke up with a painful sexual hangover, and with the zeal of any new convert, insisted that all around him adhere to his brand of newly discovered truth. Augustine is credited with developing much of the lasting theology in Christianity. He developed the concept of original sin, in which every child born carries the shame and stain of Adam and Eve's first disobedience in the Garden of Eden. He claimed that after that sin, after the fall, as it is called, Adam and Eve became lustful, sinful beings. And he even went so far as to say that no sexual intercourse was possible without sin because of the sexual passion required. He was a 4th century Andrea Dworkin-ish. Andrea Dworkin was a feminist in the 70s and 80s who said that any sexual intercourse that involved penetration was rape. Augustine said that any sexual intercourse involved sin because it required lustful passion. Augustine believed that a penis was not within the control of the body it was attached to, arguing that both erections and impotence were affected not just by the innate sinful nature of men, but by women's evil witchcraft. Sex within marriage was not a sin, he said, although it did require producing sexual passion, which was in itself evil. Proper love, he argued, exercises a denial of all selfish pleasure and the subjugation of all corporal desire to God. Augustine effectively eroticized abstinence and suffering. And here we are, 1,700 years later, in a modern culture still burdened by the lingering effects of his personal sexual shame. Thus has been his influence on Western culture. Now let me speak plainly and truthfully now. Shame is toxic. There's a difference between guilt and shame. Guilt is, I did something wrong. Shame is, I am something wrong. And our first principle reminds us that we all have dignity and worth, that we were not born wrong. We are not inherently wrong. We are inherently good. Sexuality, in the diverse and wondrous ways that humans express it, is a gift from the divine. Creative forms of sexual expression can be just that, creative forms of expression of intimacy and connection. All expressions of empowered sexuality are okay and not things to be ashamed of. All of it. So long as it is consensual and all parties have agency, it is a gift from God. Now, to force anyone, to coerce anyone, what we used to identify as wooing, remember Pepe Le Pew? The little date rapist skunk? Okay? I'm going to ask, and this is not in my script, I'm going to ask how many people in this room experienced somebody pursuing them like that at some point in their life? I want you to think about that. That's not wooing. That's sexual harassment and assault. And nobody deserves it. No means no. And I will tell you now that if your partner does not respect your no, you can come talk to me after church, drop me a line, a text, email, we'll talk. You don't deserve to be treated that way. In this day and age, we receive a lot of messages about sex and about love and relationships and what they ought to look like. Now, I cannot tell you what your love life should be, nor should I. It's not my business. But what I can talk about is healthy boundaries, agency, empowerment, respect, and consent. Sex should not hurt unless you want it to. What matters is that you are respected, happy, and fulfilled, and not attempting to live up to a false and imposed standard established by popular culture. The bottom line is that sexuality, however we may experience and enjoy it, is a gift from a joyful, loving Creator. Like any gift, it can be misused and abused, but it is still a gift to be treasured and cherished and enjoyed without shame. That is my wish for you on this Valentine's week. May it be so. Amen.